Finished seams are an important part of garments that are going to be able to last a really long time. But a lot of commercial patterns don't necessarily tell you how to finish your seam allowances. So today I'm going to go over a couple of my favorite seam finishes and when it's appropriate to use them. In this video I'm going to cover the zigzag and overcast seam finishes, a pinked seam finish, a French seam, a faux French seam, and a Hong Kong seam finish. First, let's cover the zigzag stitch seam finish. This is a really easy, really quick way of finishing seams that adds very little bulk to them. I like this seam finish for things where the inside of a garment isn't going to be super visible because even though it's pretty strong, it doesn't look the neatest. This works best for medium to heavyweight fabrics because on lightweight fabrics you can get tunneling, which will make these edges kind of pucker up and make them visible from the right side of the fabric. You can finish a seam using this method before or after you sew it up. Here I'm going to show you how to do it after you've sewn up the seam. To use the zigzag stitch method, we're going to start with our machine set to a zigzag stitch in a medium width and a medium length. What we're going to do is sew that zigzag stitch down this unfinished edge of seam allowance so that the thread wraps around the edge of the fabric to prevent it from fraying. So line up the unfinished edge with where the needle enters at the right side, and then we're going to zigzag stitch down the length. Since I'll be pressing my seam allowance open, I'm going to repeat that to the other side of the seam allowance, but if you wanted to, you could zigzag both of them together. Remember to do a couple of back stitches at the start and stop of your zigzag stitching to prevent it from unraveling. If you're working with a thicker fabric, you'll want to increase the length and width of your stitch so that it's a more appropriate size for the thickness of fabric you're using. This next method is called a faux overlocked or a faux serged finish, and I use it to seam and finish knit fabric together in one step. It works very similar to the zigzag stitch method, except you're going to do the seam and the finish in one go. This generally requires about a 3/8 inch seam allowance, so if your pattern requires a 5/8 inch seam allowance, you may need to trim it or take it in slightly before you sew this up. This maintains a lot of stretch, which means it's great for working with spandex and jersey. I actually mainly use this finish on knit fabrics, and I wouldn't recommend it very much for woven fabrics, although it does work. Most domestic sewing machines have some variation of an overlock stitch. They can be called a bunch of different things though, so you may want to check your manual. See if you have an overlock stitch, an overcast stitch, a serger stitch, or a pullover stitch, all of which are variations on this similar stitch type. I usually just keep mine set at the machine's default, although if I'm working with a really fine fabric, I will lower the width and length as necessary. Because this method seams and finishes in one go, we'll need to start by putting our fabric right sides together and pinning along the length before we run this through the machine. Just like with the zigzag stitch, we need to figure out where the needle's going to enter on the right side of the fabric, and we're going to line up our raw edge with that. For me, that's in the middle of the sewing foot, so I'm going to sew lining up with that. Your machine may also have come with a foot that looks something like this. It can be called a blind hem foot, an overlock foot, or a serger foot, and this is going to work a lot better than your standard foot for this type of stitch because of the little metal bar it has for the thread to wrap around. This keeps the edges a little bit neater and also gives you a pre-selected area where you're going to line up the edge of your fabric. If you have one of these, I would use that instead. This finish is a pinked edge. It's super quick and really easy. It doesn't add any bulk at all, so your seams will lay really flat and be pretty much invisible. This can be used on any weight of fabric, but it's not good for fabrics that fray really easily. This is also something that's not super sturdy, so I wouldn't recommend it for anything that needs really heavy laundering or is going to get a lot of strain put on it when it's worn. I use this mainly for items that are more decorative than functional. I will use this method on a lined garment though, just to prevent the seams that are going to be encased by the lining from fraying while they're in there. To do a pinked edge, you do need one special piece of equipment. These are called pinking shears or pinking scissors. My pair is from Fiskars, and you can find them usually in either a zigzag or a scallop edge. How this works is it trims the very edge of your fabric so that instead of having a straight grain edge like this, which is going to fray really easily and you can just kind of pull threads off of, you have an edge which has a bunch of tiny little pieces of bias exposed, which are much harder to unravel. This is possibly the quickest way of finishing a seam in woven fabric. All you need to do is trim your seam allowance with the pinking shears. I like to do mine about 1/4 inch or more away from the seam allowance, just because this isn't the most sturdy seam finish. And now that it's trimmed, I can take it and press it flat or to one side, whichever is necessary. Pinking can also be used to finish trim edges. You'll see this a lot in Rococo era decoration, so definitely check out some historical costuming videos to see how these are used for a decorative finish as well. The French seam is one of my favorite methods for finishing a seam. It looks really beautiful and it's super strong. This looks really nice from the right and wrong side of the fabric, which makes this great for sheer fabrics or garments that you don't want to line. All of your raw edges are fully enclosed within your seam allowance, which means this also works really well for fabrics that are prone to fraying. This seam allowance does not work well for heavy fabrics though, because it can get a little bit bulky, so I would recommend sticking to light or medium weight fabrics for this seam allowance. This seam finish also only requires a straight stitch, which means you can do it with any sewing machine or entirely by hand if you need to. With a French seam, the first step is to face your fabric wrong sides together. What we're going to do now is sew our first pass of stitching, and we're going to sew using half of our total seam allowance. So if I were using a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, I would try and sew this using 3/4 of a centimeter or less. Now that you have this first pass of stitching done, this seam allowance needs to be trimmed. I like to trim away at least half of the visible seam allowance, but depending on how much your fabric frays, you can trim slightly more or slightly less. If you're working with a sheer fabric, you need to make extra sure that this trim is very even because it will be slightly visible. Once that first seam is trimmed, it needs to be pressed. First, I press it all the way to one side, then I'll take it and press it all the way to the other side. Then the next thing to do is take our fabric and make it so it's right sides together, and press it so that that seam line we sewed first is right at its very edge and pressed as flat as you can get it. Once this is pressed, that first line of stitching we did should be right up against this folded edge. The next thing I'm going to do is take this to my machine, and I'm going to sew another line of stitching that's the remainder of my seam allowance away from that folded edge. So earlier I used 3/4 of a centimeter to sew my first line of stitching. Now I'm going to use 3/4 of a centimeter seam allowance again. Once I've sewn that second line of stitching, my seam is fully finished, and then you can press it to one side or the other. All of my raw edges are fully enclosed, and it looks super neat, which makes this one of my favorite seam finishes. French seams look really good, but you do need to decide to do them before you sew up your seams. If you find yourself wanting a similar finish and you've already sewn up your seam, the faux French seam can give you a finish that's relatively similar. It still gives you these really nice enclosed edges, and it's still really sturdy and looks really great from the inside and outside of the fabric. You're going to end up with an additional line of top stitching, which I find is really hard to see if you do it in a matching color. This is a little bit more bulky than a French seam, and the only additional thing you need to take into account is how curved the seam is. This seam finish is pretty easy to do on straight seams, but can be kind of difficult to do on curved seams, so I would suggest finding a different method to finish those. To do the faux French seam, we're starting with a regular straight stitch seam. I recommend doing this with something that's got a seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch or greater. Start with your seam finger pressed open, and then what we're going to do is we're going to press our raw edges in towards that center seam line. So here I'm lining up the very edge of my raw edge with my stitching line from earlier, and I'm going to press that really well. I'll do that with both of these seam allowances. Once those seam allowances are pressed in towards the center, we're going to put them together like that, and we're going to press them trying to match up those folded edges as closely as we can all the way down the length of the seam. Now we're going to take this to our sewing machine, and using a regular straight stitch, we're going to stitch very close to those folded edges to attach them together. Once you press this to one side, it should look something like this. It looks really good from the right and wrong sides of the fabric, but you do end up with this visible line of top stitching, and the finish is a little bit bulkier than a traditional French seam. I like to keep this finish in my back pocket though, for whenever I decide I want to do French seams after I've already sewn a seam. This is a Hong Kong seam finish, which is a modified version of a bias bound seam that allows for a lot less bulk than traditional bias binding. I really like this for unlined garments, especially coats, because it gives you a really nice fully enclosed edge, and it deals super well with really bulky fabrics. I like to add a contrasting bias tape, which gives it a fun little pop of color that can look super cute on garments where the inside might become visible. For seams that are going to be pressed open, I bind each of my seam allowances individually, and for seams that are going to be put together, like around the curve of an arm side, it's easier to treat them as one seam allowance and bind them together. To do this seam finish, you're going to need some bias tape that's been pressed flat. I like to use a contrasting color, but a matching color could also work really well. Using a straight stitch, sew one of your seam allowances to a piece of bias tape, using a seam allowance that's about a quarter of the total width of your bias tape. This will be the amount of bias that's visible once your seam finish is done. I've trimmed the seam allowance from my bias tape slightly, and now I'm going to take this to my ironing board and press my bias tape away from my center seam. Once that's pressed, I'm going to look at the back side, and I'm going to fold my bias tape over so that it completely encases the raw edge, and I'm going to press it here as well. Once it's pressed, it should fully cover the line of stitching from where I initially sewed on my bias tape. Next, I'm going to take this to my sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch in the ditch to secure down that free edge of my bias tape. Go really slowly and make sure that the needle is going in exactly where that initial seam between your bias tape and your seam allowance is. Once you've got that all stitched down, we're going to trim away the excess of our bias tape, leaving about 1/8 to 1/4 inch away from those stitches. Repeat all those steps for the other side of your seam allowance before pressing it open, and you're done. If you're doing this method on a curved seam, like an arm side, I would actually suggest treating your seam allowances as one and putting the binding much closer to your initial line of stitching. This actually works really well for arm size, and it can give a really neat appearance, which is especially great for unlined coats. This is a really small selection of the available seam finishing methods. If you have a favorite method that I didn't cover, please leave it in the comments section below. I'm always really interested to hear how other people finish their work. If you're interested, you can check out my other social media accounts in the description box. I have tutorials for a couple of other seam finishing methods up on my TikTok if you want to check those out as well. There's also theoretically a video linked here, so maybe watch that if you want to. But have a great day!